New data. Observer ID 263872. Latitude 44.449. Longitude -71.188. Date, the 11th of March, 2023. Report. Non-infected entity detected. Infrared measurement. Subject temperature at 99 degrees Fahrenheit. Entity has no visible injuries. Audio sample recorded.
Hey, I'm friendly. I'm gonna keep clearing the neighborhood. Stay safe if you're out there. I'm coming.
Observed duration, 36 hours. Entity attributes, tough, quick, heavy sleeper. Additional notes. Entity is armed with M2 Browning machine gun. Has terminated more than 60 infected entities using blunt weapon. Looted military armored personnel carrier.
Entity currently sheltering at data coordinates. Analysis. Threat level meets significant threshold for monitoring. Suggested resolution.
Pending.
Pedro had difficulty letting go of his cudgel. The blunt weapon was laminated in oily black blood, with mats of dead hair tangled up in splinters. This grotesque object had been the key to his violent survival. Now he couldn't bear to look at it. Looking meant accepting that what had happened was real. He shoved the bloody cudgel behind a bookshelf, his whole body shuddering as he stumbled faintly back onto the sofa. His heart felt weak, his blood thin. The air was too sharp, his breath too shallow and rapid. He heard a low, keening wail from inside the apartment, an inhuman groan just like the undead made, before he cracked their skulls like porcelain eggs. The wailing was impossibly close. Maybe now he would let it take him, rather than continue his pained fight over the scraps of a dead world. He realized then that the wail was rising uncontrollably from his own throat. Pedro broke into long sobs and stuttered breaths. He was alone and hopeless. There was nobody left to comfort him, or even share the burden of what had happened. Even after all he had done so far, he could die now and it wouldn't have made a lick of difference. The world had ended, and now impossible odds were up against him. After a few minutes, the sadness and emotion drained from him, empty and depleted like a gas tank run dry. His eyes rested on the M2 Browning machine gun. Without a conscious thought between, he was instantly laying beside it, feeling its steely, intricate edges and the small round bolts that held it together like some perfect machine. It was loaded with a belt of ammunition that draped and curled around his arm as he held it. The weapon was heavy like a child. It smelled of nitroglycerin, pungent and dry like scorched earth. He suddenly stopped pawing at it, as he realized at an instant that it was loaded and ready to misfire. It was time to test it. He needed to know for sure that he could fire the machine gun. With the heavy steel in hand, he descended to the field of pits. Pedro set up the gun's stand atop a mound of dirt and aimed across the field towards a ruined RV. There was no scope or sight attached. He aimed for the door handle, then squeezed the trigger with his left index finger. A sound louder than anything he'd ever heard before rang out. His arms felt like they had been whiplashed. He left the gun and walked up to the car to seek out the bullet hole. It was 2 feet away from the handle, and had burrowed through a hole in the side of the RV and traveled up through the annihilated roof. Pedro was a terrible shot. He retrieved the machine gun and climbed back up into his apartment, suddenly agoraphobic from the noise he'd made. If he had any luck, the zombies would track the noise directly to the pits and fall in, but it was possible the noise would instead bring smarter predators. With the cudgel retired, it was time for him to make a proper melee weapon. He shouldn't go without one for long. Pedro had in his mind to make a makeshift sap, or a blackjack, a lightning-fast weapon he could use to fight defensively. To make one, he'd need to tear up some leather patches from clothing nearby. He searched his apartment for leather, finding nothing, but he looted a kitchen he'd passed up before, which held a bountiful 4 bottles of lemonade, 2 strips of bacon, and 5 bottles of Belgian ale. In a dresser, he finally found a leather bikini top. He returned to the dead woman that he'd killed this morning, her body limp on a chair, resting in the doorway by the apartment entrance. Regretfully, she was wearing a leather bikini top as well. I'll spare you the details. It was filthy, but he could still use it to make the blackjack. The blackjack would be better than a basic sap, but it required more materials. He'd need a spring and some kind of heavy metal, like gold or silver, to weight the tip. Pedro decided to go searching the house to the north, to see if it might hold what he needed. This morning he'd cleared every zombie from within this city block. He felt confident heading to loot the house without any weapon at all. He went around the wooden privacy fence and past the windows in the backyard. Peering into the house, it seemed as empty as he expected. Through a window, he saw a motorcycle helmet resting on a living room table. He entered through a screen door and retrieved the helmet. It would be excellent protection against the zombies, and this helmet had the added benefit of no longer making him look like such a maniac as he did when he wore his hockey mask. The middle-class home had a lot of good loot, some common but unnecessary medicines, such as sleeping pills and heartburn medication. The kitchen had plenty of tea and sandwich condiments. He came across a tin of cat food and shamefully put it in his bag. If he was desperate one day, he could drown it in beer and be thankful. He found a roll of duct tape and 2 packs of dental floss. He could use the floss as thread for his new weapon, or any fabric work he might do in the future. Towards the back of the house, he found a water heater with some residual clean water left in the tank. He filled an empty plastic bottle he had in his bag with the clean stuff. Later, he'd return with more bottles. There was about 7 days' worth here. There were stairs that led up to a second floor. He climbed up to find a bedroom and bathroom. Out on the roof, he climbed up even higher, onto the very peak of the house. From up here, he could see beyond the power station to the north, noticing the trailing bank of a river at the edge of the thick fog. He wondered about whether a boat could take him away from all this. He couldn't imagine the zombies being able to swim. Seeing the edge of the river gave Pedro hope that he might just escape this situation. But now there should have been some assistance from higher powers. The absence made him suspect that whatever had happened at least to the entire state. It wasn't just his city that was affected. It had to be a widespread calamity. The next house to loot was just to the south, beside his apartment. 2 nights ago, he had climbed onto its roof, and from there had made his first entry, leaping over the alley and into the window of the apartment building he had been sheltering in. He entered the lower floor through a broken window, using folds of thick curtain to protect his shoes and legs from being cut by the glass. Through a bedroom, he entered a lounge. This room was lined entirely with bookshelves, and Pedro took some of the books which remained. Some he would read, and others would go into his next set of paper arm and leg guards. This place had once been an entertainment den. Games and dice were arranged neatly. It may have even been inhabited right up until the end. He imagined a large group of friends facing absolute annihilation, huddled together against unthinkable odds. In a bedroom, a bed here was utterly destroyed. The mattress had been torn to shreds, seemingly by some feral dog. He stuffed the rags of torn fabric into his sling pack. It would make for easy bandages later, and he picked up any nails he saw. He filled up his bags completely in the kitchen, loading a cast iron pot, another flashlight, and a nearly full bread bag inside. Pedro went home to unload his loot in the apartment, then sate his hunger with a jam sandwich. After, it was back to looting the house. A stairwell led down. He had his flashlight, so he descended, without caution. Immediately, he heard a great amount of movement. As he flicked his flashlight on, they were already upon him, coated in muck and swarming with insects. A dozen undead, probably those scared few who had fled down here from their games and dice to cower, in a room now covered with cockroaches and putrescence. Dozens of slackened arms shot up towards him as the multitude erupted into a cacophony of hungered cries. They suddenly rushed at him. A giant cockroach was clinging to his arm, its rigid mandibles piercing through his shredded paper armor. With the flashlight, he beat the thing's hardened exoskeleton. It fell on the ground, but left behind a stinging, toxic saliva. Quickly, he stumbled backwards up the stairs, cold hands reaching for his meaty calves, pulling at his steel-toed boots as he rushed up and around the corner, back into the bedroom where he first entered the home. A cockroach hungrily skidded across the floor after him, and up his leg as he kicked it off and closed the bedroom door behind him. The skittering mutant insect brushed its shelled face against the door, its prehistoric mind nearly unedited by the infection, mandibles visible in the small crack below. It was too weak to break through the door and too large to crawl under. Pedro sped through the room and out of it, cerebellum quaking from horrors etched in genetic memory. To the pits he ran, picking up a bit of rebar from the ground and wielding it like a lance. He knew it would be only seconds before the zombies and infected roaches would come flooding out of the house. Already he could hear the zombies beating down the same door he'd closed behind himself in his flight. One zombie was now visible and in pursuit. Inside the building, he could hear the others tearing up the bedroom, searching for his scent trail, which was being helpfully blown away by the wind. He positioned himself so that the zombie fell into a pit, and then gouged at it with his rebar. Some thrusts, and it was dead. There were thundering footsteps and skittering roaches within the house, but out here in the pits, Pedro had the advantage. He waited for them to come to his land. A zombie stumbled into a bedroom that faced his pits, and came at him clumsily through a window. He put it down, then another two came forward. He led them through the pits. One more zombie made 4 dead. The flow of zombies stopped. He went around the side of the house, spotting one of the bloated cockroaches beside a windowsill. He shouted, the insect responding to the tremors of his voice in the air. He hated that cockroaches could hear. The fat roach crawled over and dropped out of the windowsill as he rushed back between the pits. 3 roaches pursued him. He shouted. They could hear further than they could see. The first fell into a pit as its body snapped under its mutated form. He shouted and brought the other 2 unnatural bugs through to a similar end. There were still more zombies left inside. He went back to the bedroom and 2 more spotted him. They followed him. Pedro rushed around, trying to get them to fall into the holes. By chance, they kept stepping aside and around. His breath became more heavy, his lungs unable to keep up with the chase. His stamina was exhausted as the tough zombie grabbed him. He couldn't break free. The two zombies struck him over and over. A fist to his torso knocked the wind completely out. They gnawed at him. Desperate, seconds from death, with one final push he tore free and rushed a step away. He was utterly exhausted. Another grab like that could seal his fate. The two zombies at last fell each into the pits, spines snapping as they landed heavily on the other bodies. He was injured. Pedro worried that the last few zombies and dozen roaches might be able to best him if he fought them now. He caught his breath and retreated back to the apartment. He made bandages out of his rags and applied them all over his agonized body. He popped a pill of codeine out of its plastic bubble packaging and followed it down with a wash of lemonade. In minutes, the pain faded, still present but distant in the background. His torso had taken the brunt of it. His Kevlar vest was meant to protect against bullets. The fists of zombies could still bring him down by numbers. He dropped the piece of rebar he'd been wielding. Pedro looked over what materials he had to make a new weapon right now. While he didn't find enough materials for a blackjack, he could still make a sap. He took off his work gloves, then set to disassembling the cleanest of the two leather bikini tops. It came apart in 3 patches of leather, more than enough to make his sap. He bundled rounded scraps of metal between the cups of the leather bra, sewing it closed and reinforcing the strap so that it would hold under duress. The sap was nearly as big as his fist, with a leather wrap that went around his palm. When he swung, he could hit harder and faster than a regular punch. This was a fist weapon suited for street fights. It would do him well against the undead. He practiced his swings. He could take a first strike upward, annihilating a zombie's jaw from below. The second strike could then come from above, cracking its brow or caving in the side of its temple. The main advantage of the sap was its speed. It was fast enough to strike, then if a stunning blow was not landed, he would withdraw a step. He practiced the pattern, striking the jaw from below, then striking down at the temple from above. Pedro was becoming more conscious of how he fought. He practiced a brawling style. He knew at least enough about melee fighting to be able to feint, recovering from a miss to take a quick recovery strike from another angle. While he wasn't fully healed, Pedro wanted to get back out there and test his new sap out. There was one cockroach across the street. He shouted, luring it to him, and began to smash it with his sap. He missed and with a practiced recovery strike managed to land the next hit. The roach's exoskeleton was hard to crack. The roach tore at his arm bandage, but he killed it without taking much damage. Not the cleanest fight, but he had a good sense for the sap now. He headed back to the house with the basement, searching for any more of the zombies or cockroaches. There were none left up here on the ground level. He stepped down into the basement, his creaking footsteps bringing forth movement in the dark. He climbed back up, and 2 zombies rose after him. He lured them into the pits, beating them with his sap as further practice. Now it was time to descend for real and see what was down there. He turned his flashlight on and stepped down. Waves of skittering insects cowered from his light. He spotted one standing zombie, the top half of its head an open wound, bugs crawling forth from the nesting gouge. The floor surrounding 2 pool tables was littered in a mess of whatever the bugs had been eating and ejecting. The smell was better left undescribed. He held his nose closed with one hand and aimed the flashlight with the other. Pedro walked into a room with a bookshelf. A book here, Modern Rifleman, seemed to be exactly what he needed. Hopefully it would teach him about the workings of his new machine gun. As he entered the main room, the sounds of fists smashing the side doors became loud and agitated. The door tilted off its hinges, and he saw behind it a group of 4 zombies. He'd need to get these ones out before he could explore any further. He rushed back upstairs, his thighs burned from the strain. He had been so full of adrenaline, he hardly had noticed how weary he was now. There was no way he could fight this new group of zombies. He left and returned to his apartment. His body needed rest now, or it would surely fail him in the middle of the fight. He rested on the sofa and read through Modern Rifleman. It was a treasure trove of information about rifles, describing how to make numerous rifle mods, and even adapt certain ammunition for different purposes. Most importantly of all, he was well on his way to his first level of rifles. Soon he would be more confident about shooting the machine gun when it became necessary. He made another jam sandwich. He was feeling less weary after a few hours' rest. His torso was in okay shape. The light was beginning to fade, and Pedro wanted to use the last few moments before the light went out to finish what he'd started at the basement. He flicked his flashlight on and descended back down. The zombies were in the main room and turned to him. They followed him to the pits, 4 of them, and Pedro strategically worked the ghouls back and forth as they tripped across the field. He smashed his sap down on their heads while they were stunned, backing away from the group when they began to surround him. Without taking much damage, the 4 were dead. There was one more, a child zombie. The children were fast but weak. Not willing to risk it exhausting him, he brought it a shorter distance to the dining room table and beat it down as it reached for him like some demanded supper. Descending again, he checked around the corner where the last zombies had come from. One decayed zombie remained there, almost entirely eaten away by the insects. He lured it over an armchair and beat it down while it swung at him. He opened a door, 2 zombies within, one crawling and the other decayed by the bugs. He shut the door. The 2 were weak, possibly too weak to escape. There was a water heater beside the door with more water, another 6 days or so worth. Later, he'd retrieve the water and finish these last weaker undead. He searched around. There were 2 bedrooms here. No windows. He'd known from his past life of working on home renos that this house wouldn't pass fire code. That fault was what had killed them. They couldn't escape from this basement. Their bodies had then been desecrated by insects with no regard to the decency of a proper burial. In a wardrobe still in the rot-filled basement, he found a fresh tank top and swapped out the torn one he had been wearing. It felt good to finally have something clean against his skin. Although the basement was repulsive, the bugs hadn't been able to enter this drawer. 10 aspirin, not much considering what trouble it had been to clear this basement. But at least it was now safe, and the dozen zombies and roaches within wouldn't trickle out and cause him problems next door. Pedro went home and applied a new set of bandages as the light faded across his room. It was now the 3rd night of the Cataclysm and his 3rd night in this apartment. He made a jam sandwich, removed his clothes, and climbed into his bed covered only in a blanket. He set his alarm to wake him up in 6 hours. That would be enough rest to get going again before the sun rose. And that's enough for this episode. I finally found the YouTube genre of analog horror. Analog horror is a genre of video composed from archival or stock footage combined with text and visual effects to create immersive horror movies. It's a wide and accessible genre, so there's a lot of variation. A lot doesn't really appeal to me, but there are a few gems that are incredible and worthy of recommendation. My favorite theme from them is existentialist horror. I like this sort of slow, dreadful stories that don't rely on shocking imagery, but rather on some kind of realization that is cleverly revealed as the story develops. I have a soft spot for viruses and zombie stories. If you know of anything like that, I'm sure the other viewers and I would love to hear recommendations in the comments. I've prepared some analog horror recommendations for you. The first is a classic zombie apocalypse called The Awakening. It's one of those play-by-plays of a zombie apocalypse that tracks the significant events, almost like a timeline that leads to the total apocalypse. It details this with a kind of realism where the emotions bleed through. This zombie apocalypse timeline story works particularly well with analog horror, as the story is told through news bulletins and emergency alerts. It uses a mix of voice actors and computer-generated voices as the story develops and the zombie plague takes over every country and system of government.
Within the past few weeks, a new virus, by the name of K17PXVI, emerged from Seattle. The pathogen has completely puzzled scientists, especially with its apparent ability to infect a person's brain and provoke a homicidal rage state.
When watching a timeline like this, my mind fills up with ideas of stories based on their version of the classic zombie apocalypse. The Awakening goes for something similar to World War Z, with horror that reaches into international politics and crisis responses. Some of the writing is a bit funny compared to what a government might actually communicate to the public, and it doesn't have the same degree of realism as World War Z, but I take this to be the author's way of communicating the feelings and emotions of the society as it falls. But overall, I really enjoyed The Awakening and highly recommend it as an example of a classic and traditional zombie story. But the first video that really awakened me to this analog horror genre is called The Tangi Virus. It begins with a medical researcher who discovers a new virus in a Louisiana waterway. As she learns more about it, she realizes the virus's strange attributes and the immensity of what she's up against. She tries to report her findings, only to come up against a grander, more sinister realization that taps into themes of government conspiracy and cosmic horror. The Tangi Virus has a sequel called The Oracle Project, which expands on the virus story and takes it a level deeper into philosophical horror. This story centers around an AI which can calculate answers to any question and is given the role of protecting American national security. I'm convinced it's inspired heavily by a 70s movie called Colossus the Forbin Project, which was a Cold War sci-fi thriller also revolving around a scientist and their hyper-intelligent sentient computer. My last recommendation, and really one of the classics of the analog horror genre, is Gemini Home Entertainment. This series is like a horror puzzle sent from another planet, disguised in the language and uncanny valley normalities of Earth. As you put the pieces together, each video reveals more about the story's bizarre universe that is so much like our own but broken in a fundamental way. It's really incredible in terms of immersive media. They mix in their own recorded videos and illustrations as well, which are really fantastically done. I'd recommend it if you're looking for something towards the genuinely terrifying end of the spectrum, as it's more intense than the others, without being shocking or mean-spirited. As I keep making these episodes, I might dabble in some of the techniques that I'm learning from analog horror. So, with all that said, take care, be well, and I look forward to the next episode of Cataclysm: Dark Days Ahead, Tales from the Final Day.